Welcome everybody to our Performance Health webinar on static, progressive and dynamic splinting without kits. I gather there are lots of you in many countries around the world. You're very welcome. It's lovely to see you all, although obviously I can't see you. If you've got questions as we're going through, don't hesitate to put them in the chat and we'll try and address some of them towards the end. But it's my privilege to be presenting this for you today. So my name is Nicola Goldsmith and I'm a hand therapist in London. I'm the clinical ambassador for Performance Health, as well as having a small private practice specializing in musicians. This is my clinic here. I'm also the past president of the International Federation for Societies of Hand Therapy. So let's have a look at some of the theory behind making these splints. The first thing is to really identify the difference between a static progressive splint and a dynamic splint. So they can look absolutely identical. The only difference is how you are actually moving the part of the body, either with elastic or without. So a static progressive splint is without and a dynamic splint is with. So they both depend on having a really well-fitting base of the splint, really excellent strapping so that you don't get friction as you're moving parts. You also want a very informed and committed patient. They're not easy to tolerate or to cope with because they generally can be a little bit bulky. And it does depend on the skill of the therapist to make it really well, to ensure it doesn't rub or cause movement. So you want to have very clear goals to decide that you want to do a static progressive or a dynamic splint. So when you're making your bases, and we've got two here that we're going to use, they need to be as closely fitting as possible. And the strapping needs to try and prevent friction and ensure that the fit, as you get movement of the hand or movement of the moving part, that you don't get irritation of the skin. It's also really important to make sure that the unaffected joints are not restricted. So you don't want to block anything that is allowed to fully move. And you want to make sure that you're not blocking, of course, the part that you're working with. So don't forget things like if you're blocking below the MCPs to do a dynamic flexion of the MCPs, you can't splint right up to the distal palmar crease because as you move into flexion, this is going to get in the way. Of course, that's what it says in most splinting textbooks, but it's wrong. If you want to have free motion of the MCP joints, you really need to stop your splint at least a centimetre proximal to the distal palmar crease. And then, of course, as soon as you're moving anything, you've got to be mindful of that 90-degree rule, which we'll look at as we develop these two splints together. So what is that 90-degree rule? Well, I've tried to draw here for you what I mean. And that is if you've got a cuff on an area of a finger and you want to try and move it. So for example, if you've got a cuff and you're trying to move the MCP joint of this index finger, the pull needs to be at 90 degrees to the actual bone. And that's important because you want to make sure you're not putting any sort of distraction or compression into the joint. So that is really where you have to be very imaginative as to how you attach things. Of course, it's the same if you are doing dynamic extension. Again, you need to make sure that the pull is at 90 degrees above. And then this also makes sure that the cuff is sitting in a position so that it's not going to cause pressure. So as people gain range of motion, you're going to have to change where you are placing this cuff and how you are actually placing the dynamics. What else is important? Well, of course, to get a well-fitting splint, you've got to have the equal and opposite force. So what do I mean by that? So if you've got a splint on the dorsal surface, you've got to make sure that the forces that is applying on the dorsal surface are equally managed by straps at the distal end and the proximal end on the volar surface, or the other way around. And this makes sure if you use that triangulation that you don't get this movement. You want to really think about function and profile. The lower the profile, the more manageable it is for people. The days of really tall splints and understanding that you can actually move the traction to other places are here with us. There's also advantage sometimes to the patient being able to see traction. So when we look at the dynamic extensor splint, I'm going to show you how to do it for MCP arthroplasties. And I actually really like having the traction along the back of the splint, because that means that as the patient's looking at their own arm, they can see when they're affecting movement of the MCPs. Whereas if they're actually bending at the tips of the fingers, nothing will happen on the elastics here. So they'll get immediate feedback. We're going to talk a little bit about elongation theory, and I've put this splint in the top right-hand corner. Please never, ever produce a splint like that. The direction of traction really matters. So again, if you're working on traction of each of the MCP joints, as you can see this splint in the right-hand corner is, the little finger does not pull down towards the pisiform, it pulls down towards the scaphoid. And if you pull it down towards the pisiform, you're going to cause critical damage in that joint. So all of the fingers should be aiming towards the scaphoid. So direction really does matter. The first point of contact of the cuff is where you have to get the 90-degree rule. But what you do with it after that, it doesn't matter. The amount of force, though, does matter, because you need to really look at the lowest possible force to be able to make the effect you're trying to make. So tissue elongation theory. So this static progressive splint that I'm going to make, I am making specifically to hold tissue that is very tight, very stiff, post-fracture, in its comfortable end of range. So what we don't want is to put a lot of force through. All that's going to do is cause inflammation, which will cause, again, more fibrosis and more scar tissue. We are not trying to stretch tissues, we're trying to elongate them. So there are two main concepts: LLPS, low load, prolonged stretch, and total end range time. That means the longer you can have in that 24-hour period where you're holding someone at their comfortable end of range, the more effective it is. Up to 11 hours, between 6 and 11 hours is absolutely ideal. So how do you choose whether you're going to use a static progressive splint or a dynamic splint? And the way I like to do that is using something called the modified Weeks test. So if you work with your patient, analyze the joint, measure it at the beginning of your appointment, do your modes, do your active range, do your combined range, a little bit of passive, use heat, all the different modalities that you would throw at a stiff joint, remeasure it. If you get minor amount of change, you want to work with a static progressive splint. So you've got no elasticity. If you get significant change, you can work with a dynamic splint, i.e. elastic traction, because that means that you can actually have the splint accommodate over that 6 to 11 hour period so that it is changing and putting that constant gentle pressure at end of range. The last thing really is the challenge, and the challenge is selling this as a concept to your patient. It's really difficult to get your head around. Thankfully, I have one with me who is highly intelligent, totally on board, and gets it. So we're going to work together to show you what we're going to do on a static progressive splint. So before I get on with the theory, and before I finish with the theory and get on with the practical, here are just a few examples. So you can see some dynamic flexion splints and some dynamic extension splints, and in fact, one that does both. Just if you were thinking when I showed you that splint that moved the little finger and the ring finger into the wrong direction, that it's very difficult with small hands. Well, that splint you're now seeing in the top right-hand corner was on a 7-year-old's hand. So there's no excuse. You really can do dynamics on a tiny, tiny hand. So you've got my email address there. You've also got the email address for Performance Health. So if you've got any queries around all the products that I'm going to be using, by all means, please email them, ukcustomersupport@performancehealth.com, and they will help you. So I'm going to pass over this iPad, not my iPad. Thank you. And I'm going to concentrate on this lovely hand here. So if we move to the overhead camera, what I'd like to do is just show you that we have here a thumb that has had a significant injury and had open reduction internal fixation of the proximal phalanx 8 and a little bit weeks ago. It was a comminuted fracture. Not all of the fracture pieces were captured by the ORIF, and there's actually a dorsal scar and a volar scar, sorry. And they are both incredibly tight. Unfortunately, Louis didn't get referred to hand therapy in the early days, despite the surgeon suggesting he should have early active movement. So by the time I saw him, these scars were absolutely thick and tethered on both sides, and they are restricting motion, and the joint itself has become very painful. So we've been working on releasing the scar. We've been working on active motion because the MCP works well, the CMC works well. And now that we're past 8 weeks, we feel comfortable that we can now put a static progressive splint on. But progress is slow, not that it's a problem, it's just slow. So I've already made a base so that I can concentrate on making the actual static progressive piece. So you can see here that it's incredibly well fitting into the palm and ducks very well below the IP joint crease, so that as we gain range here, there's plenty of space for the IP joint to actually flex forwards. So this is going to do up really nicely. Again, I use contour foam on the back, which stops the splint from moving around, so it's really stable. So what we want to do is produce this static progressive splint. Now, this joint is really painful, so we're not putting masses of force through it. We're just putting a gentle force through it. And the most important thing for me to do here is to make sure that I've got this 90-degree angle coming through. So I'm going to use some monofilament, which I'm going to just thread through the cuff so that I've got a traction coming through here. And I'm going to tie it off this length. And then we're going to attach the pieces to the splint. So that's going to involve painting the splint on and off a few times, because obviously I'm not going to use the heat gun while it's still on. But you can see here that I've now got the ability to put the traction through. So the first thing I want to do is work out how am I going to make a hole that this can run through at the 90-degree angle. And of course, that 90-degree angle is going to start moving. It's going to start here, but as we gain more movement, it's going to come further towards the palm. So first thing I'm going to do is use a pen and just very gently mark onto the splint where I'm going to want to attach a piece. And then I'm going to ask Louis to just pop the splint off for me, if you can. And then I'm going to heat a little piece of hyper-perforated material. Sorry about the noise of the heat gun. Okay, so always want to make sure that I have rounded edges everywhere I possibly can. I'm just going to round that edge there. I'm going to heat in the palm where I put the mark. Okay. Mind your fingers, obviously, very, very hot. Okay, so I've now got heat to heat, and dry heat is better. because it is less likely to be an issue. Now I want to pop this straight back onto the hand. We're going to become an expert at doing that. Okay, so here's my cuff. And here's my piece. Are we on the overhead camera? Yes, lovely. And so what I want is to make sure that I've got this piece of material at an angle. That means that I've got a hole that I can go through. Will be at 90 degrees here, which I do, which is nice. So we're just going to let that go off. Now, at the same time, I've got to figure out how I'm going to get this to be comfortable around the splint, because when you do a small splint like this on the hand, you actually haven't got very far to go. There's not a lot of material available to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some paper clips. Again, I told you that I was going to do this with no expensive kits. This is what life in the NHS has taught one. Okay, so I'm just going to slightly rotate this in a nice shape. So I'm going to attach this one into here, and then I'm going to attach a second one. Down. Oh. And I'll bring the second one down into here, and then we're going to attach it at the bottom. So again, I'm just going to mark. One's going to go there. It's going to go there, and it stops the whole thing being all over the place. That's it, and that's feeling quite secure there. Can you pop it off again? Right, so we're going to do the same again. I'm going to use a little bit of material. I tend to try and use the same material because it does look neater. So this is Polyflex, which I absolutely love. So it's very, very moldable. So it gets into all the little intricate spaces. Again, just heat the two spaces. Be really careful not to overheat, because you don't want to lose the beautiful position you've got on your splint. So, just going to cut the small piece of this. There's the first one. Embedded in. Just go straight on, I think. And here's the second one. So we'll just go straight in. So all I'm doing is just making a nice pathway. Now, the reason for using metal is because the monofilament works really nicely on metal. It's not going to catch on it, and it won't affect the traction. So I do like using metal wherever possible. And then the last thing I'm going to attach onto here is a bit of seething hook Velcro. Okay. Right, shouldn't need to keep taking it on and off again. It's engineering, basically, as you can clearly see. Right, good, just pop that on again. So the last thing I'm going to do is get a little bit of Velcro. So you can see, literally, we have not had to buy any extra special kit at all. I'm going to use my hole punch to put a hole into this piece of Velcro. Here we go. Beautiful. So I'm just going to wait, check that that's not quite firm yet, but essentially, let's pop this through here in an overhead camera, and then I'm going to choose which hole I'm going to put through. try that one. Now you can, one of the lovely things about having a multi-perforated material is that I can choose exactly. Now that looks pretty much dead on 90 degrees there. So then we're going to pop that through here and pop that through here. And what I want is, because this is a static progressive splint, can I lift you up a little bit there? Okay, so I am going to attach this to this bit of Velcro. There we go. And I'm just going to tie it off. And then I hope you can see if I turn this way up. Here's that piece of Velcro that I had. And then you can just see how it feels. And it literally just attaches itself here. And by attaching itself here, we're holding that joint in the best flexion that we can. Now, obviously, this is only going to increase in its flexion. So the last thing I would do when I take the splint off would be to actually get rid of this top bit of material, because it doesn't need to be there, but it is good to give myself that freedom to use it. Okay, so let's just pop that off. Undo here, because that will release the tension from the band. And then immediately that releases. Yep, brilliant. Superb. Pop it off. So the last thing I'm going to do is just round the edge here. Sorry, that flew off. Okay, make sure it's nice and sharp. And so there we are. So here we have the static progressive splint. So literally, as your thumb improves, you've got this piece that you can move along as it gets stronger and stronger, and then of course we can shorten this as we get there. How does that feel? Right, let's, oh, I was going to say, let's just check you can get it on and off. There we go. The knot is just in the way. Do a bit more. So obviously they get quite tight. It's different when you're working with elastic because you can pull a little bit more on the structures. So put a little knot in here. Just move the knot as things improve. And it really is very simple, very, very simple. Now, the only thing that would differentiate this from a dynamic splint, so it could look absolutely identical, would be that there would be a bit of elasticity in that pull. So if this joint begins to move really quite well, what we'll do is we'll swap some of this for some elastic. Right, do you want to just see if you can get that on? Now this one goes to the top one, okay? Yeah. So, yeah, so always put the cuff on first and always put it on after you've done your exercises. Yeah, perfect. And then just gently hold it at its end of range. So you're not putting massive force through. There we go. You okay? Good. Yeah. Piece of engineering. Wonderful. Right, I'm going to swap you over for my other victim. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So this one is a dynamic extension split. So again, I've made the base already. So here we have the base. So that last one was made out of polyflex. And this one, polyflex 2, is called, this one is easy for light. And I just really wanted to show you how to really make quite a large splint out of a very light material, because it's got enough contour in it that it's going to be really nice and rigid. So what we're doing with this one is that making sure that this piece is nice and solid. You'll have noticed that I haven't put the straps on at this distal end. There's a good reason for that. And I'm now going to use the little bit that was left at the end of cutting this out to make the outrigger. So I'm just going to pop that into the splint pad behind me. And I'm going to just check whether that rubs. If it does, then you can always put a nice bit of contour foam underneath it. Sometimes helps you get a really nice fit, particularly if someone's had MCP joint replacement, then you've got wounds over the back of the, obviously over the back of the MCPs, and that can be a little bit sore. So if you place a bit of contour foam over like that, firstly, you'll get a better contact, and secondly, so it feels a bit more secure now, doesn't it? Okay, so this is going to sit like so. Now you'll have also noticed that I've put a few holes, just using a basic hole punch, top and bottom, so I'm going to show you how that can be used. So with MCP joint replacements, what we're trying to do is make an outrigger that is going to be above, so that our 90-degree rule comes here. So my 90-degree rule is such that I need to be above here, but there also needs to be a radial bias, not an ulnar bias. So I'm not putting this way. I want to have 90 degrees up, but radially as well, because we're wanting to make sure that the capsule reforms nice and strong and tight on the radial border and nice and loose on the ulnar border, so that when she's moving through range, then there's always that sort of slight dynamic movement laterally. Of course, if you're making this for a radial nerve injury, then you'll just come directly above it. Okay, so I also wanted to show you, because I promised this would all be about how to do this all very much without spending lots of money on stuff, is actually you can also make your cuffs out of Velcro. So there's no reason, I mean, I love these suede cuffs, but there's actually no reason, unless you want to spoil your patients, which I usually do. So you would literally cut these to the right length for your individual patient. So if we use these ones, this, and then place the hole easily through this. So here we are. So here's our index finger. Now it's important that you cut the width that is shorter, just shorter than the length of the proximal phalanx. So that's the index. Keep that one there. Just want to get them huddled up. That's middle. Again, the width is okay, but it's a little bit on the long side. So just cut this. Go through it. Middle. Same with our ring. Again, it's very slightly too long, that one. So you can have a whole load of these ready. There's pre-hold. And then the little one, just remember that you're probably going to need to have this narrower. So if I do this, you can see now that if she was to bend the PIP joint, that's going to be really irritating. So actually, I want this one to be a bit narrower, that end, to make it fit a bit better. Here we have lovely cuff for the little finger. So here are mine in order. Just get rid of those. Okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to attach my outrigger, obviously not while it's in situ. So I'm going to take those off and I'm going to do very similar to before. The best way of getting fixation of these materials, none of them have a coating, so it's really easy. but the best way is to heat both sides. Dry heat both sides. So here's that piece of leftover material. What I'm going to do is just cut it into a long, thin rectangle. And then I'm going to roll it up. Now, as soon as we make a roll, it becomes very, very strong. I'm going to just gently increase its length. What I'm looking for is the length that will work above her hand and have enough space for fixation. Flatten it out a little bit, and you'll see why in a minute. Right, let's heat both sides. So now you can see why I haven't tried to keep your hand away, why I haven't put the straps on yet, because they're going to be in exactly the same spot as we want to attach the outrigger. So we want to get the outrigger on first before those straps. So dry heat to dry heat. There. There. Now I want to bring it onto the hand. This is where we need to work quite quickly. Okay, now I want to be above the hand. Now what I would normally do is I would get a rolled up towel or something like that into the palm so I can see the particular angle that I want the fingers to be at, and then I want to be above it. And I want to be above the middle of the proximal phalanx, but radial. So here I am above, a bit radial for the index finger, and then I'm going to put the middle one pretty much on top of where the index finger is. With the ring finger, I'm going to again, we radially have it pretty much above where the middle finger is. The little finger, I'm going to have it above where the ring finger is. So it's offset. Now I would normally take this off my patient. However, he trusts me. Do you trust me? So I'm just going to put these holes through. One. Now they often don't quite come through, but there is none. 3, 4. So I wouldn't normally do this on the patient. Okay, so I can just be sure. Beautiful. Right, I'm going to pop this off. Okay, two of the holes actually came through. So here's one of them. Yep, that one's done. That one's done. Lovely. So I don't want to reheat until this is really nice and rigid, which it is now. So I'm just going to reheat these edges. I can smooth them off. Again, I would always try and use the same material because I just think it looks the nicest. Same colour, same texture. Because these are difficult things for people to tolerate. And then I'm going to attach these nice bits of hook Velcro. And now you can see why I didn't do it beforehand, because I wanted to make sure that I could fix the outriggers in exactly those spaces. So it's still warm. So here's that one. There. And then the other one once this is on. Okay. So I'm going to put that onto you again. Lovely, there's that, and there's that, which is just holding it still. Right, so now I'm going to perfectionist in me. Always around my edges. Okay, so here's this here. This is going to come lower than the MCP, so it's not going to get in the way. And then look at where it actually lands on the back. It's not up here, that's going to get in the way. Right down here. So that's where I'm going to attach the piece of Velcro. It's not hot, the material. So I'm just going to heat underneath. So this is now going to come and fix over the back. Right, so now we have the outrigger in place and they're sitting in the right place for the fingers in extension. Now what I've got to do is turn it into a dynamic splint. So there are so many options and I thought I would show you a whole variety. So you can either use elastic. So you want to choose a nice elastic that's got a really nice end. It doesn't come to sort of like a short end. It should be able to expand out really nicely. So let's, for example, let's start at the other end, it's easier for me. So I might want to just do literally an elastic straight from the cuff straight up through the hole. Now, the really nice thing about having an outrigger like this is I can either go with the 2 bits of elastic, one through and one at the front, or I can go one through and one at the back. Just gives me a little bit of play with that 90-degree rule. And I can clearly see that one through and one at the back gives me a better angle. So I'm just going to attach this. Now, I only want to put as much force as I can hold that finger into really gentle extension, but allows really good flexion there. So there's that one. So that's super simple. You don't have elastic. Here's a nice little trick. Roll up a little bit of TheraBand, because they used to make lovely thin strips of TheraBand, but they don't anymore. If you try and cut it straight along the line, what you'll find is it will fray. And as soon as it frays, it will just break. So if you roll it and cut it and then open them out, then it's less likely to fray. So this one, again, if I show you, we can just pop it through the hole and attach it in exactly the same way as I attached the other one. The other really good use of paper clips. Pushes through. Again, push through. Here we are, we're turning this into a multi-coloured splint. So again, I can figure out, do I want it at this end? Do I want it around the middle? Do I want it? So I can choose. I think, in fact, again, it's going to work best here. And again, the lovely thing about TheraBand is it's got this lovely long motion. So to flex with that will be super easy. And of course, you can choose which level of force. You're very rarely going to want to go above a red on a hand. So try that. There you go, that moves so nicely. Now, remember I mentioned earlier that you might want to see the traction. So how do we do that? So back to monofilament. If I attach my monofilament through my cuff, and then up through the next hole, now, what we don't want is to have again, a sort of traction through that's going to be very, very bulky. So the best thing is to bring it back down onto the splint as quickly as you can. So can you see I've put these holes at the end of the splint? And so I can literally just put this through the hole. Or maybe I can, maybe I can't. There we go. To here. Now you just need to make sure you've got enough that when the patient bends, it's not going to catch on the hole. So I can put a little tie there. Then I'm going to show you how to use TheraBand to make a long traction. Doing very well. See, there's a wonderful ones I've got. So then, again, open up one of my pieces of TheraBand. And I can just literally feed it through here. And I've got holes at the other end as well, and I can literally attach it down here. Well, that's going to be super tight. You see it's pulling that finger way too strongly. So single length is going to be better. Tie this end. And again, pop this one through a hole. Tie it at this end. Now it doesn't matter which hole I go in, it just doesn't matter. All that matters for the 90-degree rule is where this falls. Everything else just doesn't matter. You just need it to be convenient and easy for your patient. So I'll tie that. Okay, but there are a few other little tricks that work nicely. Again, you could use the paperclip trick that I just did on the static progressive splint, so that you can put paper clips there, or I could hold that underneath something along. And then I'm going to show you with the little finger, one of the things I really like doing is using a little piece of aqua tube. And a little piece of aqua tube really keeps things nice and close down onto the splint. So it's really, really low profile. You can do this by attaching it down here. You can attach it along here. We could put two little pieces on, and I'll show you how to do that. So I want to figure out where I want them to be. So again, I'm just going to use my pen just to show this one. Here, in line with that hole. This one, lovely. Okay, and we're just going to pop the splint off. And because it's a dynamic splint, you've got plenty of motion available. Because of the elasticity, it's really easy to pull these cuffs off. Do the splint. Okay, so just going to slightly heat the splint. Again, slightly heat the splint. Slightly heat a bit of aquaplast. So it's just aquaplast with a hole in the middle. Same again. There. And then you can literally feed through these. And that's really nice because it keeps everything very, very low profile. So attach. Potentially, I can either attach another piece of TheraBand, or I can actually use a spring. So the spring will fit in here in the hole that I've made, and then it will attach up onto here. They make shorter ones and longer ones. It's just attach this here to the string, and it needs to allow the movement. Through. So you can see this is just a little bit too close, but it will allow the spring to move backwards and forwards. Then we would feed under here, and then we will bring it up and through. and then attach it twice much. And then we'll attach it to the cuff. And then you'll see that we've got a very, very low profile dynamic traction, so that it really should be very easy for somebody to manage. This goes through here, this goes through here, and then we're going to attach it on. So would you like to put that on again? Go for it. Bring this off. That's it. This comes around. You want to make sure the traction is always on top of the Velcro. So here we've got, you can see, very, very low profile. Got the strap underneath everything. And this just sits absolutely flat onto the splint. Now, I would never make one with all these different traction types. So you've actually put this on too far up. So a little bit further down. That's it. A little bit further down. These should all sit on the proximal phalanges. 1, 2, 3, and then there would be 4 as well. And I just want to show you that they've all got, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that they've all got a radial pull on them? So this one is being pulled at 90 degrees, but over towards the radial side. And again, you should be able to see that they're all pulling towards the radial side, which would just be the right thing to do for somebody who's had MSc joint replacements for rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, so there we have our cheap and easy ways of making dynamic and ecstatic progressive splints. So I don't know whether anybody's put any questions into the chat, but I will let you go and have a little look while I feed this through. And then we'll see if anybody wants to ask.
So we have a few questions. The first one is about the slides. We can share the slides after the webinar along with the recording as well. Why not start with the dynamic stretch cord from the start? It's a question.
Yeah, you can do an entire, yeah, absolutely. So I would, the reason I actually didn't do that today is because that's all I've got. So, but yes, you can literally work with a whole dynamic stretch cord from one end to the other if you want to, or just use short traction. So I'm just trying to show you so many ideas. And in fact, this is a piece that I made for teaching with all different, so how to make a book, how to use the end of the splint, how to make a little hole and feed it through. I mean, there are just so many options.
The other question, are the thermoplastic uncoated to allow for a good bond?
Yes, so these are chosen uncoated materials because that's by far the easiest. You really don't want to be bothered with zopping everything to take the coating off. So Polyflex 2 and Easy Form Light, which is what I made this whole thing from. And the other one was Polyflex 2. They don't have a coating. And so you'll get a really, as long as you get no water between, so dry everything off and make sure that everything has got not even the tiniest bit of water. If you're doing dry heat to dry heat, you will get absolutely permanent bond.
Could you please explain, could you please give some more details about the radial bias?
Okay, so MCP joint replacements are generally, if they're done for rheumatoid arthritis, they are done in order to manage the subluxation of the MCP joints and the ulnar drift or ulnar deviation. Therefore, when the capsules are reconstructed after the surgeons have put the replacements in, what you want to do is to try and give a radial bias because the patient is very used to sitting ulnarly. You still have the radial deviation of the wrist, so there's still a zigzag deformity. So you know that if you allow somebody to go straight back to function, if you've got equal tightness of the capsules on both lateral sides, then the tendency is to go straight back to doing activities with an ulnar push, and they will deviate really quickly. So I like to do mine with a really nice radial pull, so that as people are moving through the flexion extension plane, it's always pulling the proximal phalanges just radially, so that things get nice and tight on the radial side, just to help protect from the recurrence of arm deviation.
What hand condition does the second patient have?
Oh, none. Our second patient is a model, so actually she doesn't have one. It was purely for demo.
Can you demonstrate cutting the TheraBand so it doesn't fray again, as it was just out of camera shot?
Oh yes, sorry. Okay, so let me just put the overhead camera back on again. Apologies, I can't actually see that, of course, as I'm doing it. So what I generally do is cut a piece of TheraBand, and then do you want to, is that in, yes, in shot? Okay. So what I would then do is literally as tight as I can, roll it up. I've just found that if I try cutting a whole length, that you send a patient home with it and then it frays. And then I just cut it through. And then, scissors. And then unravel it. And I tend to find that that just doesn't fray in the same way as it would if it was, if I just tried cutting it. Try it any way you can, but in the absence of having these lovely sort of ferro strips, which we used to have many years ago, I've just found that that is the securest way, in the way of getting the straightest edges.
From the great range of different ways to create a dynamic digit extension, do you use certain ones for certain conditions, PTs? If so, which and when?
Yes, I suppose I do. If I'm making a dynamic outrigger for radial nerve, obviously I'd have to have a thumb piece on it as well. I would generally go with short traction. So I'll just remove that camera. So I would do it either with elastic or with TheraBand direct. If I'm making it for MCP joint replacements, I like to have this elastic along the back, because if my patient moves with their MCP joint, you can see the traction moving, and they get really good feedback. Because if you think about these are very damaged joints, and they've been compensating and doing a lot of intrinsic minus movements previously, so forehand previously. And a lot of people find it hard to get those intrinsics working to initiate the MCP flexion. So I like to be able to help them understand that when they do this sort of exercise, they'll see no feedback. And when they do this, they will see the feedback. So they can be sure that they're doing their exercises properly. Then the other things that I would potentially make a dynamic outrigger for would be, well, I used to make them for extensors, but probably not so much anymore, and they can have short traction. And the same with PIP replacements. I tend to now use the short arc motion regime, but when I was doing it with a dynamic outrigger, then I would use short traction. You will see in the presentation, actually, there was one from a PIP joint replacement, and you'll see that it actually has the splint coming with the outrigger on top, with the cuff, of course, on the middle phalanx this time. And actually what I've done is built a piece of material on the volar surface, so that week by week you're controlling how much the PIP is allowed to move. So the first couple of weeks, you're really just having a tiny bit of movement, and then you just move that further and further and further over the weeks. And you'll see there is actually a picture of one of those.
What is the thickness of the thermoplastic used for the dynamic splint?
1.6.
Have you got evidence around the elongation stretch time for best outcome?
Yes, if you go to the wonderful article written by Celeste Glasgow in, I think, 2012, I will look it up and maybe we can find a way of getting that to you, but that she explains absolutely beautifully the theory behind elongation of tissues and why you would choose static, progressive or dynamic splinting. And then there are so many studies by Flowers, by Prosser, by so many that look at the best amount of time, so that total end range time, which is how come we know that you really want between 6 and 11 continuous hours out of every 24.
Did you tie one finger to the overhead bar and then another to the proximal end of the splint? If these are two options, why would we choose one over the other?
I think I've covered that. I think we've covered why you would do one long traction. I did different ones for each one just to give you a whole load of ideas. There are also little hooks. There are so many different ways of attaching this. Really, the only one I would do long traction for are the MCP joint replacements.
Is the short traction vs long traction used for the same purpose, i.e. is the long traction only for visual feedback to the patient? Asking this question as the short traction obviously saves material.
Yes, that's completely right. It depends on the quality of your elastic. Now, sometimes if you've got an elastic with a really short end, you know, you can only get this much movement with it, then you're going to need to do long traction with it because this just won't be enough to allow the joint to go through full range. Because I've got a really nice elastic here, I can afford to do short traction because this is enough to allow full range. Of course, if you use TheraBand, it's always enough because it doesn't really have an end point.
Did you use monofill or elastic for the ring finger and little finger?
Monofilament. So it's got it's rigid. And the same as I use on the static progressive splint, it's absolutely rigid. It doesn't go.
Have you got experience of working with patients who need extension at one joint and flexion at another? We often get these patients due to oversplinting and get a little stuck about how to splint them.
Okay, so it'd be really nice maybe to do a webinar on PIP joint stiffness, because that is the dilemma you have, because people tend to retain range of motion in the middle and lose extension and lose flexion. On the whole, I'll work on extension at night and flexion during the day because our flexors are really strong if we're talking PIP joints. You'll see again in the presentation, there is a splint that has dynamic extension for two fingers and dynamic flexion for the other. That's the one with the flower on it. That was a slightly, that was a patient with a really good attitude because actually she had a conversation, unfortunate conversation with the lawnmower. So we had a flower on her splint. So yeah, she had put her hand underneath the blade of the lawnmower and caused herself quite a lot of damage. So we needed to dynamically extend and dynamically flex. So it's all very possible. You may be able to do it on one splint, you may have to do it on two. Flexion will generally come back through function, through exercise, through heat, through all the other modalities, but extension, particularly for PRP, will never come back without your intervention.
One last question. Are you able to list the splint material you used in the demonstration in the slides? I can answer this question. We will be sending an email, a follow-up email with the recording and the slides, as well as all the material that Nicola has used in the webinar. And there's quite a few questions left. We don't have time, unfortunately, so we'll get back to them in writing, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I'll get back to all of you who sent other questions, and I will add another slide to the presentation, maybe just explaining all of the kit that I've used. But you can see it really was very, very simple, nothing, nothing expensive. So thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.